Thank you for joining me for this episode of God Talk. And in this episode of God Talk, I want to talk to you about the growing identification with LGBTQ plus in this country. Why am I doing this in September and not in June? Well, because someone had sent to me a Gallup poll that I'm going to share here a little bit later in the podcast that has some pretty startling numbers. The poll that I'm going to share is taken in February. I will say this past June seemed a little bit different than the more recent Junes past. I just don't feel like, in general, the gay pride thing was shoved down our throats nearly as much as what it has been in the past. I had one company, Kroger, tell me to celebrate, Gay Pride Month, and honestly, I used to shop there every Sunday, but since then I've been doing Amazon Prime. I still will run in there on occasion, pick up some odds and ends, but they're not getting the lion's share of my grocery money. Why? Because maybe Amazon Prime doesn't support that? No, I'm sure they do. They just don't like rally the troops. They don't solicit me to join them in celebrating something I don't agree with. And so I'm sorry, when I can make a choice to not follow and give business to a company that has no business even talking about that, because I don't even want to think about that being handled with my groceries. No, thanks, please. That doesn't need to be emailed out. That doesn't need to be pushed. And so I've cut my business with Kroger. Not that they really care, but at least 90% faithfully every week would get my groceries there. Not going to do it. Not going to do it anymore. And so last week or so, I was doing a message on Mount Sinai, and that's where God gave the 10 Commandments. And I made a comment in the sermon that I don't want to say I thought it was profound, because you probably don't think it was profound, but for me, I thought it was one of my, every time I write a sermon, I have a deeper revelation. And one of my deeper revelations for that sermon was that we've got a lost generation or two because we've removed the 10 Commandments out of the classrooms, out of the courtrooms. Remember Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, at this island that Peter Pan is taken to. There's these boys that just were forgotten. Their parents had died or became foster kids or what have you, and they're kind of left to their own to kind of run amok on this island. Well, I would maintain that by removing the 10 Commandments, which had been really the foundation of certainly Western civilization and civilization in general for the last 3,500 years, that what we have is at least one generation, if not two, over the last 30 years, that kids have been being raised and now grown into adulthood that no longer have the concept of a absolute morality, of an absolute right and wrong. That was my premise. And I still believe it to be true. And if it's true, there ought to be some quantifiable evidence that shows that the younger generations don't have the same values that the previous generations do. And so, as I mentioned, I had a friend that sent me this Gallup poll. It was released in February of this year. And it's pretty, let's just say it's pretty startling. That it shows the difference in generations between those who identify as LGBTQ plus individuals. And so the first thing that caught my attention looking at the survey is that 9.3% of U.S. adults, almost 1 in 10, will identify as either lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or something other than heterosexual in 2024. And to me, that seemed like a very high number. For me, I would probably be more comfortable thinking about the number as being about 3% or something like that. What's interesting is Gallup started this in 2012. That's when they started tracking this. And in 2012, it looks like it was somewhere around about 4%. And so in the last 12 years, it's more than doubled. 4 to 9.3, and the 3 to 4% would be the range that historically, like I'm thinking, would be a kind of a safe number to go with. That people that follow this, what has clearly always historically been a deviant, a sinful, a wrong, not looked favorably upon lifestyle. And we just see in the last 12 years this significant growth. I mean, when you over more than double the entire population that is subscribing to this, before we even break it down into like when people were born in generations, I mean that's pretty significant. So let's break it down, because this is where it gets really crazy. And then it gets crazy on top of that crazy too. But amongst the silent generation, 1945 and earlier, only 1.8%. Now, I mean, I'm going to say, like, before 1945, I just kind of thinking maybe they don't even really think about that stuff anymore, but very low number, very low number. Then we got our boomers. They're still young enough to be trying to enjoy that part of life. They're at 3%, and that's where it is in my mind. Like, okay, 3% of people, not an insignificant, but certainly not significant, a number of people that will identify as being LGBTQ plus. Then we get to my generation, Generation X, and that's, I guess, when the wheels start coming off the cart, but still not too bad. Only 5.1% of Gen Xers identify with that behavior. Now, what I've maintained is that the last couple generations have grown up without the value of God's law, of knowing that there's right and wrong. And this is exactly what then we see. When we get to the millennials, 14.2%. 3 times that of Gen X. 5 times that of the boomers. And, some of you young people, you guys think the boomers are idiots. Like they're only at 3%. Like, you millennials, you're at 14% of identifying as LGBTQ plus. Who's the idiot now, right? Not that boomers can't be kind of unique on certain things, but certainly not when it comes to this. And then look at this next one. Or I should say listen to it, since it's a podcast. Gen Z. 23%. Almost 1 in 4 people that were born between 1997 and 2006. So that puts the youngest of them at 19 years old now. 19 up through late 20s. 1 in 4. 1 in 4 identify as LGBTQ plus. Crazy. Now, the gender gap is even worse. So Gen Z, 23% identifies LGBTQ plus. 31% of women do, and 12% of men in that Gen Z grouping. 31, almost 3 to 1 women over men. What is going on with that? And when we get to the millennials, 18% of women and 9% of men identify as LGBTQ plus. So in both these crazy lost generations where morality has gone out the window, women 2 to 1 over men. 2 to 1 over men. I mean, the men's numbers are significant, but the women's a whole lot more are identifying as LGBTQ plus. Now, why is that scary? Well, I would say that's scary because the women are the primary nurturers, at least that's how God made them, in terms of the raising of the children. In a lot of households, the dads aren't, they're not checked in as much emotionally. They're not checked in as much in terms of time and that they spend with the kids and so forth. Like, I don't know if that's changed in Gen Z, in millennials, but like if it has, what's scary is like the women 2 to 3 to 1 over men identify in this morality lacking like view of this world, like views that are moralless. Is that a word, moralless? It's startling that that's who's raising the kids. And so how does this get any better? So in relationships and marriages and like life, like things can spiral up and they can spiral down. When I do marriage counseling, I talk about, things are bad, and that, like, when you get ticked off, that leads you to be ticked off, and then you're more ticked off, and it just spirals. Well, things can spiral up and can spiral down, but this is be an example of where things are kind of spiraling down, aren't they? That I would maintain my revelation that I shared in my Mount Sinai sermon, that the last generation or two have been raised without moral absolutes of right and wrong, and that's going to have severe consequences on society. That begins to spiral down. We remove the 10 Commandments, and as a result, you've got 31% of Gen Z women identifying with a lifestyle that first and foremost doesn't even perpetuate having offspring. And then what's going to happen to the kids of them who grow up thinking this is normal, and they're taught by their parents that this is normal? It's kind of like a death spiral. It's kind of like a plane that loses its engines. Like, how do you pull out of that? Well, I mean, you don't, unless you have like a restart, a reset. Like, I watch air disasters, like when they lose engines, they're kind of, their last hope is to kind of like try to restart them, right? And if they restart, I guess you can pull out. But if they don't restart, then you can. We kind of need a reset. We kind of need a restart. And that's where I mentioned in Texas, I was very like surprised. And initially I would say I was even like, wait, is this a good idea? When Texas voted the legislature this past summer to require the 10 Commandments in all the classrooms in Texas. I got an email from someone who's a teacher at our school, and she said that that's being challenged, and I think the order's been put on hold. And in her school district, it's up to the individual if they want to do it. And then she said, which was kind of my original thought, is like, and I don't even know if that stuff should be forced upon them. And I'm like, what about the 10 Commandments is bad? What about it's controversial? Maybe the first one, don't have any other gods before me. Maybe some people take offense at that, but all the other ones, like how is that bad for society? Like, don't covet, don't steal, don't murder, don't commit adultery. Like, how are these bad? Yet Satan knows that if he fights to kind of dig out underneath the foundation of the 10 Commandments, that we no longer use them because we're afraid that that's too closely tied to religion, and we don't want to impose our religion on people. He knows that, well, we're going to be an island of lost boys and girls. Lost boys and girls because we're lost, because we don't know right from wrong, good from bad, and lost because we're not even going to know who our daddy is, who our heavenly Father is. It's it's eye-opening. How do you go? Like, let's forget let's not even include the silent generation. I mean, they're 80 and above. Let's go the boomers. How do you go from 3% thinking something is right? Or what the question wasn't if there's right. 3% of people identify something with boomers. And how do you get to, within, say, 50 years, 23% of a generational group thinking that's normal? That is an 8-fold difference. You only get that. You only get that by ripping out the 10 Commandments from society and indoctrinating people through emails from Kroger, through many years ago when I pulled up to Chase Bank, no longer do business with them after this, and I was trying to pull money out of my ATM and it told me to celebrate Pride Month. Like, it only happens when you've physically removed what tells us what's right and wrong, and then you've reprogrammed people to say what's right. And you know what? The only ones left to teach different is really the church and parents that hold the views that the 10 Commandments speak to and represent. And that number is getting smaller and smaller all the time as well. Hey, it's worth a fight. We want to pick our fights. One of the fights that we need to pick is, let's bring these 10 Commandments back. Because without the 10 Commandments, we don't stand a chance. This is just one example of how, when you remove morality, how marriage suffers, the family suffers, and society suffers. But I guarantee if you dig into like the differences between some of the older generations and some of the younger generations, you're going to find that on a lot of different issues, especially in issues of right and wrong, there'd be a pretty significant difference between the two different groups. Because in one group, there is a standard of what makes right and wrong. And in the other, there is none. And everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. And I have to tell you that that's not going to be good for families. That's not going to be good for individuals. It's not going to be good for society. It's not going to be good for anyone. Thanks for joining me for this episode of God Talk, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. God bless.